Great. Hi, everyone. Well, my name is Andrew Strait. I'm the Associate Director of Research Partnerships here at the Ada Lovelace Institute. Those of us who don't know us, we're a research and delivery body based in London with a mission to ensure that data and AI work for people and society. And a lot of our work is focused on studying the social and technical implications of various forms of algorithmic systems used in public and private sector. My background as well is that I come from industry. So I used to work on a team who was responsible for trying to implement ethics processes at a large organization many of you may know called Google. And my background is also in content moderation. For many years, I was a content moderator and a policy specialist working on content moderation issues there. Today, I'd like to start us off in this brief conversation with describing 4 key challenges I think AI poses for human rights, rule of law, and democracy. And I want to flag these are not the only 4 challenges that AI poses, but there are 4 key ones that I think will help elucidate some of the discussion we'll have later throughout the day. In this conversation, I also want to give a broad sense of how AI systems are developed, because I think that's a good way to visualize the different ways and different moments where an intervention can take place to help mitigate the kinds of harms and impacts of these systems on human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. So before we go any further, I think it's good to add some context that we are witnessing an enormous shift in the datafication of essential parts of our lives. An enormous amount of data is produced every second about ourselves, and that amount is only increasing year on year. And worryingly, it's not just data from social media or applications on our phone, it's forms of data about your personal life, your health, your finances, your identity, and even those around you. We're being categorized, tracked, monitored, and quantified like never before in human history. And a major reason why we're seeing this rush to datafy as many parts of our lives as we can is this notion of trying to augment or replace human decision-making for the sake of convenience in many parts of our day-to-day lives. Now, AI systems run on data. AI broadly refers to systems that display some kind of intelligent behavior. And AI systems often rely on algorithms, which broadly refers to a set of rules or instructions that a computer can follow. A good metaphor for thinking of an algorithm is a recipe for cooking. It gives you a set of instructions to use specific data, the ingredients, to create a particular outcome, the dish. But a more precise term for many of the systems that we're concerned with is an algorithmic decision-making system. These are tools and technologies that seek to aid or replace human decision-making. Some common examples that I'm sure many of you are familiar with include systems that automatically identify and flag hate speech on social media platforms, scan CVs and resumes to predict the likely successful candidates in an application for a job, and systems that predict the likelihood of success or failure of a loan application. A key point that I want to really drive home throughout our conversation is that it really is less important about the technical details of a system and more important what the impacts of that system are on you and those around you. Whether it's a very powerful machine learning system or a very simple statistical model, or even just a spreadsheet, the less important question is what the details of that system are. And the more important one is how is that affecting those around you and other affected communities of that system. I want to briefly touch on how an AI system is developed, because I think this can give us some good insight into some of the early stages of intervention that could have impacts for human rights, rule of law, and democracy. So we can use, for a hypothetical system that does resume scanning. It claims to automatically evaluate a resume and assess if a candidate is a successful or unsuccessful hire before they've even gone into an interview. There's 2 general processes that we'll talk about. The first is a training process, where data is collected and then run through an algorithm. The data in this case might be previous CVs and resumes from other jobs from successful and unsuccessful candidates. And the algorithm that's running on this might be weighting certain features of those applications or those CVs over others. For example, the grades that were on those resumes that were successful versus not, or the schools that they attended versus the ones that were not. That creates a trained system that can now be run on new input data. So let's say it's your resume, you're applying for a role. It's run through this trained system, which scans for the different criteria and renders a decision to hire or not hire. And in many of these systems, that decision is then fed back into the training data, which forms a feedback loop. Now, there may be humans who inspect various parts of this process. That decision may go to a human HR professional to make an assessment. But in some cases, if it's a very large firm and there's a lot of applicants, there may be no human involved in that decision at all. It may just be going off of whatever the system decides is a good or bad score. I want to zoom out for a minute, though, to focus on the fact that that stage we just talked about, that development stage, is just one part of a much broader life cycle around the integration of an AI system. If we go back further, we can see that these products are reliant on existing research from academic and corporate communities to develop those systems. They're reliant on private and public funders like venture capital firms, research agencies, government funds, which set an incentive for an organization's development and business model. What kinds of clients will they serve? What kinds of problems will their products seek to address? And how are those problems being framed? For example, if the product is supposed to be a tool that helps assess visa applications, is the problem being framed as a tool that will help make the visa process easier for applicants, or to help remove unwanted individuals from the visa application pool? Many systems are developed and sold onto a third party, which creates power imbalances, where the client of a system often may have no access to the data, code, or understanding of how a system they're using operates. In the case of the CV and resume hiring case, many large employers outsource that or purchase that system from a third party. They have no control over the data that it's being trained on or access to the code to contest any of those decisions. I flag this point because some kinds of harms and implications that AI pose aren't just about the product or the system itself. We often have to look holistically at the kinds of incentives that are driving certain applications and how they are integrated into complex social systems if we're going to fully understand the implications for human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. Now, I want to flag these 4 key challenges, which I think fit across that life cycle. The first is this notion that there's a very short duration between the research, AI research, and the productization of that research. AI systems don't really require much resources to build in many cases. Large data sets are available online for anyone to play with, and access to code and compute required to train a system is relatively easy to come by. This makes the barrier for harmful outcomes much lower than other technologies like biotechnology, which require significant investments in access to hardware like wet labs in order to create new technologies. It also makes anticipating harms harder and makes regulation and oversight more difficult. And to give an example of this in practice, deepfakes, these hyper-realistic images and video, the underlying technology for that only came out in 2014 in a research paper. But by 2017, only 3 years later, we were seeing it widely used in gendered sexual harassment campaigns against women worldwide. A second challenge is this notion that AI systems can often make opaque processes more opaque, which makes contesting those systems extremely challenging, let alone even knowing when they're in operation. That makes a challenge for understanding the impacts on human rights or the rule of law. If we don't even know if a system is being operated, how are we supposed to assess it, to monitor it? A good example of this is the Home Office visa algorithm. This was a system that took information provided by visa applicants and automatically processed it in the UK. It gave each person a color code based on a traffic light system of green, amber, or red. And one metric used was nationality. The legal agency Foxglove, which challenged this algorithm in court, alleged that the Home Office kept a secret list of suspected nationalities, which would automatically be denied a visa. You can see similar stories in other high-stakes settings like child social care algorithms, which determine the risk of a child in a care home setting. Or to take another case from the UK Home Office, a sham marriage algorithm, which was found to be racially biased. It would assess marriages and try to determine if they were likely done for visa purposes or for other purposes that appeared to be unlawful. There's a challenge here that when you don't have access to those decisions and no way to contest or challenge those decisions, it can make already opaque processes that are deeply entrenched in our society even more complex and challenging to monitor and address. A third challenge is that AI systems can operate at extreme scale and speed, which exacerbates the risks of human rights harms and implications for the rule of law. Law cannot keep up. It is a blunt tool. And many of the AI systems that we are talking about are integrated without much consideration beforehand as to their impacts and risks. Rare is it that affected communities are consulted by developers of these systems before they're implemented. Even rarer are the cases in which developers are working and actively partnering with affected communities to develop tools that serve their needs. This is particularly true in large-scale platforms like social media platforms, which are multinational and global in scale. It means that tools don't translate well from one context to another. To give an example, Facebook launched a hate speech algorithm that was trying to capture known instances of hate speech across its platform. But unfortunately, it also began in 2018 to capture ads for LGBTQ events. Their filters flagged anything relating to the word gay as being potentially unsafe or for children or politically sensitive. And this was largely because people were feeding in data from all different parts of the world into that system, which often meant that it didn't really have a very nuanced approach to very specific applications. It couldn't tell if someone was using the word gay in a positive way or in a derogatory way. And we're seeing that happen actually this week. A report just came out a few days ago showing that Twitter and Instagram's hate speech filters are censoring content about Palestine and Sheikh Jarrah, being unable to determine if these are posts that are inflammatory and hateful, or if they're posts about actual news coverage or responses to the crisis occurring there. The speed and scale at which these systems are developed makes monitoring them and understanding those impacts extremely difficult. That's one of the many, many challenges I think we see when we talk about these systems being deployed, particularly at large scale settings like social media. And a fourth challenge that I want to flag is the notion that these systems are dynamic and they learn from historic data. And that means that even with positive intentions, they can still cause harm, even if a system passes muster in lab settings. If an impact assessment is run in lab settings, that system can still cause harm when it's put in use in the real world, trained on other real world data. A very disturbing example of this was a 2019 report about an algorithm that was used in hundreds of hospitals across the United States that gave patients a risk score for needing additional treatment. The algorithm's data focused particularly on the annual total healthcare costs accrued in a year of different patients. But if you look at the nature of that data, there's some underlying systemic bias and racism inherent in it. In the United States, the average Black American spends far less on healthcare per year than a white American for numerous reasons, in part due to existing income inequalities that are rooted and systemic in the United States, but also relating to levels of distrust of the healthcare system and direct racial discrimination by healthcare providers. So while the system appeared fair when it was developed, when it was deployed in real world data, it quickly developed a very biased outcome. Black patients had to be sicker than white patients before being referred for additional help. Only 17% of patients that the algorithm assigned to receive extra care were Black, when that number should have been about 50%. This example also highlights another related challenge that even with a human doctor in the loop reviewing a decision, an algorithm can still affect human judgment. We call this algorithmic bias. The system's suggestion that a patient didn't need further treatment ultimately affected their referral, and this ended up affecting millions of Black Americans until it was caught. So I want to leave you with some final thoughts, and just in fact, one real big one. We've walked through some of the key challenges that these systems can pose for AI democracy, for human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. And I've also walked through some of the ways in which these systems are developed and integrated, those moments and parts of a different development process where an intervention could apply. And one thing I'd really love to discuss in the breakouts and in the discussion Q&A is what safeguards and mechanisms we can implement to address these challenges. I think we're talking about, in many ways, some types of technologies that pose unique challenges that require unique solutions to address. But some existing mechanisms that you already use in your day-to-day work may well be suited to mitigate some of these harms. I want to thank you so much again, and I'll now pass it back to Vanya. Thanks.